The notification arrived without any grand display, yet its gravity was undeniable. Within the royal residence, a definitive verdict had been formalized and shared with key figures. Prince Harry and Meghan Markle were officially barred from reclaiming their royal responsibilities or rejoining the monarchy as active representatives. This marked no mere passing feud. The crown had firmly locked the gates, with no intention of reversing course. Before analyzing the deeper ramifications for the House of Windsor, remember to subscribe to keep pace with every update. Holding the conclusive paperwork inside his study, King Charles received the official decree from Buckingham Palace, confirming the couple's permanent exclusion from senior duties. The monarch studied the critical sentences twice, set aside his spectacles, and silently rested the sheets. Balancing paternal affection against his sovereign obligations had reached its breaking point. Though safeguarding the throne from constant chaos, this choice meant accepting that fatherly love could no longer grant entry to the institution. Gazing out the window as the final phrasing was authenticated, Prince William experienced a wave of quiet relief. Years marked by closed-door friction, public allegations, and broken truces had long paralyzed the crown between hope and instability. Beneath that relief, however, simmered deep resentment. He recollected past efforts to establish boundaries without outright coldness, only to witness those boundaries weaponized. An active royal, someone authorized to formally represent the crown, was prohibited from operating independently while utilizing royal prestige. William demanded absolute clarity on this boundary. A court official slid the authorized text into a scarlet dispatch case meant for state affairs, securing it firmly. That single gesture solidified years of internal dispute into unyielding state policy. Far from just blocking official roles, the decree isolated future interactions with Harry strictly to the family sphere. Charles noted this distinction silently, while William remained motionless. Celebration was entirely absent. Before public release, the notification flashed across the Atlantic to California. Scanning the measured prose, Meghan Markle immediately detected its underlying finality. The palace was neither playing for time nor offering ultimatums. The option itself had been completely erased. Her gaze shifted toward Harry, signaling that the upcoming turbulence would originate from more than just Great Britain. While courtiers readied the public for this administrative conclusion, those at the center faced a far more devastating reality: the absolute fracture of a family unit that once deemed itself unbreakable. Behind the polished prose stood four individuals anchored to vastly conflicting interpretations of the same tragedy. To Charles, his son had drifted beyond rescue. To William, his brother had shattered a sacred bond. Harry felt his relatives had disregarded the true weight of his grievances, while Meghan viewed the establishment as prioritizing its own preservation over her inclusion. Though disseminated globally, the emotional toll belonged exclusively to them. Alone by his kitchen counter in California, Harry stared at the digital document on his mobile screen. Raised within the strictures of the monarchy, his entire life had been regulated by protocols defining his position and public image. Serving as an active royal undertaking duties on behalf of the sovereign had once provided him with identity, a clear mandate, and a permanent spot alongside his kin. Escaping the United Kingdom yielded independence, but this message demanded a devastating tax for that autonomy. Rejoining meant submitting to regulations he had already abandoned, while staying away meant forfeiting any prospect of reclaiming the heritage he assumed would always remain his. Reaching the concluding lines, the younger prince tightened his jaw. The vocabulary carried no overt insults. It was far more clinical. It severed private kinship from public state rank, ensuring personal affection could never serve as a backdoor to official duties. He detected William's strategy immediately. The future monarch had erected an iron curtain between brotherhood and the crown, designed to outlast any future debate. Turning the screen face down, Harry offered no reply. Meghan walked in, pausing as she noted his demeanor. She had successfully carved out an identity independent of palace oversight, driven by personal agency rather than royal sanction. Even so, this definitive closure stung. As it stripped away the leverage of deciding whether to return on her own terms, she inquired quietly if it was truly over, receiving only a silent gesture of confirmation from her husband. Pulling out a seat without sitting, she hovered between irritation and vindication. The very apparatus she accused of casting her out had now validated their exile. Yet, this finality brought no sense of victory. Charles had fought to embed a singular human truth within the text. insisting that no administrative jargon could dissolve Harry's status as his child. Even as the monarchy dissolved all expectations of official service, William demanded a matching boundary from the opposite side. Family interaction could persist, but it could never be parlayed into institutional power. Their uneasy truce was frozen within those disciplined sentences, balancing a father's grief with a brother's skepticism. Meghan looked at Harry once more, their unspoken understanding absolute. This climax had not materialized from this document alone. It originated during a past family assembly where a private plea escalated into open conflict, proving to the palace that lifting the ban would merely bring the storm back indoors. To comprehend why this boundary became unyielding, the narrative must revisit a meticulously arranged family gathering that degenerated into an incident the palace could never erase from memory. This permanent severance did not originate with the press release. It erupted months prior within a secluded sitting room at Windsor Castle. A dialogue intended to mend fractures instead demonstrated just how insurmountable the distance had become. No press pools, public addresses, or spectators were present, only Charles, William, and Harry, facing a dilemma over what they could still tolerate. Charles entered harboring a fragile optimism he refused to extinguish. Preliminary exchanges hinted that Harry might attend a forthcoming family milestone under specific parameters, and the king trusted that familial warmth could pave a narrow path toward reconciliation. Windsor, a principal sovereign residence, provided sanctuary from the bureaucratic machinery of London. This seclusion was vital because the encounter was intended to prioritize family ties over institutional standing. William, conversely, arrived burdened by a separate anxiety. He worried that another superficial compromise would legitimize royal standing before the underlying betrayal had been resolved. Harry remained quiet until the formal greetings concluded, at which point he presented several drafted sheets upon the table. The younger sibling requested an explicit public affirmation that he and Meghan remained fundamental to the family, alongside a prominent ceremonial presence at the scheduled event. A ceremonial presence implied a visible, state-sanctioned position during official events, independent of full-time working duties. For Harry, this request did not symbolize a pursuit of power. It served as validation that his spouse and offspring had not been banished from the lineage. William interpreted the move entirely differently, viewing it as an attempt to utilize the throne's prestige without submitting to its constraints. Leaning forward, Charles endeavored to untangle two agonizing realities. He informed Harry that while he was entirely welcome as a son in private, he could not appear publicly as a face of the monarchy. The king reiterated that love endured, but official reinstatement required a level of trust that had been destroyed. Harry's expression turned cold. What his father labeled a distinction felt to him like rejection cloaked in affection. He questioned how a familial welcome could possess any sincerity if Meghan was relegated to a private entrance while others occupied positions of prominence. Then came the ultimate trigger. Harry asserted that his wife would not set foot in Britain unless the crown offered a public apology for historical grievances and ensured identical ceremonial standing. William pushed his chair aside, looking directly at his brother to state that no public roles would be negotiated while private dialogues were continuously weaponized in the media. Harry gathered his notes before the king could de-escalate the tension. As the younger prince reached the threshold, William's parting words paralyzed the room. The crown would not continuously unlock its gates for an individual, utilizing them as a platform for attack. The younger prince exited without a word, leaving the monarch stranded between an abandoned seat and a son unyielding in his verdict. Though the Windsor encounter concluded without a resolution, the genuine emotional explosion manifested later when the siblings confronted one another directly, entirely abandoning courtly decorum. Certain disputes permit future reconciliation, while other clashes expose that such a path has evaporated. When William and Harry convened privately after the Windsor disaster, they did so without courtiers, counselors, or prepared scripts. They stood not as the successor and the expatriate, but simply as brothers, bringing years of deep-seated bitterness into a single space. What occurred did not invent their estrangement. It destroyed the final fantasy that their rift could be easily mended. William had initiated the confrontation because he demanded his brother hear the ramifications firsthand, rather than through bureaucrats or heavily managed correspondence. The heir, the individual next in line for the crown, feared that any indirect communication would be leaked, spun, and converted into another media assault. Harry agreed for the inverse reason, convinced that the elder prince was the primary obstacle blocking his family's acceptance. Each entered entirely certain that the other had distorted history. Closing the door himself, William remained on his feet. Harry deposited his phone on a side table to demonstrate that nothing would be taped. Yet this action failed to cultivate trust. It merely underscored how thoroughly it had vanished. The younger sibling penalized the family for enforcing silence while dodging accountability for the duress Meghan had faced, declaring that every instance of candid communication had been branded as treason. The future monarch listened patiently before his composure fractured. William countered that every confidential effort had been systematically met with a public revelation. He referenced Catherine, their offspring, and the psychological toll inflicted when internal family dialogue became content for broadcasts, docuseries, and memoirs. The prince maintained they had been pulled into a feud they never sought. Rejecting this defense, Harry asserted that institutional omerta merely shielded the establishment while leaving his household completely unprotected. Neither brother shouted initially, which gave each word a sharper edge. William ultimately delivered the boundary without embellishment. He would never endorse a system allowing Harry and Meghan to alternate between commercial enterprises and state authority whenever it suited their interests. Royal authority, the public leverage and official status derived from representing the sovereign, was non-negotiable. Harry perceived the underlying meaning instantly. His brother was not proposing a temporary freeze, but executing a permanent banishment. Stepping closer, Harry demanded to know if William spoke as a brother or as the voice of the throne. A heavy silence filled the space. After a prolonged pause, the heir answered that on this matter, no distinction existed. That conclusion altered the landscape permanently. Their fraternal feud had officially transformed into succession policy, the long-range strategy intended to persist when the next sovereign ascends the throne. William opened the exit as the encounter ended. Harry passed him without a glance, harboring a resentment that had solidified into absolute certainty. Nevertheless, both princes recognized that ultimate sovereignty remained with Charles. The monarch now had to determine whether his optimism as a parent could outlast his obligations as a king. The siblings had reached a precipice neither could retreat from, but only a single signature could transform their domestic breakdown into permanent state doctrine. Power within a palace rarely manifests through shouting. Sometimes, it crystallizes in the quiet glide of a pen across parchment. Charles had spent years safeguarding the hope that time might dilute the bitterness and restore lines of communication with his younger son. Yet, the crown could not exist indefinitely in a state of limbo. When the definitive proposal landed on his desk, the king faced the dilemma that every parent dreads and every monarch must execute. Charles remained at his desk after his strategist departed, their brief still splayed before him. The brief maintained that ongoing ambiguity crippled the monarchy, as every instance of family contact ignited fresh media speculation regarding reconciliations, ceremonial duties, and restored leverage. A hybrid configuration living autonomously while selectively maintaining state privileges was an experiment the palace viewed as completely bankrupt. While William could insist on rigid perimeters and courtiers could polish the phrasing, only the sovereign possessed the constitutional and household authority to validate this permanent stance. Without his endorsement, the conflict remained an open wound. Charles reached for a brief, handwritten message Harry had sent years prior. The sentiments belonged to a child addressing his father, not the Duke of Sussex communicating with the crown. While a duke represents a premier noble designation, here it symbolized the public obligations, scrutiny, and drama linked to the younger prince. The king positioned this memento alongside the official proposal. One page radiated warmth, the other mandated estrangement. Together, they illustrated the agonizing deadlock he had postponed for far too long. Camilla entered the quiet room, discovering him staring at both documents. The queen consort remained silent initially, recognizing that any counsel would register as pressure, which was the last thing he required. Charles finally confessed that endorsing this decree felt like admitting a profound personal failure, having trusted that endurance might reconstruct what malice had fractured. Placing her hand near the paperwork, she waited, permitting the sovereign to find his path as both a father and a king. Charles lifted the pen, but amended the text before endorsing it. He refused to categorize Harry and Meghan as outcasts from the family unit. Instead, the final terminology dictated that their severance from official state life was absolute, permanent, and entirely closed to future mediation. The nuance was vital. His son would never be evicted from his heart, but the Sussexes could never again leverage family ties to access state power. Charles applied his signature. He held the pen in place for several seconds as the ink dried. No celebration followed. The endorsement shielded the institution while cementing the alienation from Harry, realities the king processed simultaneously. Camilla watched him secure the folder, aware that this single act had stabilized the throne's trajectory while deeply wounding the man who commanded it. The king's endorsement terminated the debate at the apex of power, and within hours, the directive rippled through the royal household with effects no public relations effort could obscure. Ultimate verdicts materialized through cold logistical realities. A name vanishes from an organizing roster, a confidential communication line is terminated, an expected invitation fails to arrive. As the court machinery adapted to the sovereign's mandate, the repercussions reverberated far beyond British shores. In California, Harry and Meghan were not simply reading a press release, they were witnessing the final threads tying them to official state life being unraveled, one systematic directive at a time. Royal courtiers operated swiftly once the signature was registered. Prospective ceremonial arrangements were reorganized to ensure no one could infer the Sussexes might function as active royals, represent the head of state, or occupy a formal station at state functions. A royal commemoration, a state-sanctioned ceremony honoring an individual or historic milestone, would henceforth feature Harry strictly as a private family member, subject to personal approval for any invitation. This distinction was critical because public billing creates perceived authority. A single seat, procession placement, or official acknowledgement could imply the rift was merely temporary. The palace was determined to eliminate such ambiguity. Harry received formal notification that the upcoming commemoration would offer him no official capacity. He scanned the message once, stepped back, and gripped the frame of a chair. Returning to the screen, he parsed the words again. This operational shift cut deeper than the public announcement because pageantry had anchored his existence since infancy, serving as proof that he belonged to a grander legacy. Now, that same institution was progressing without his participation, no longer obligated to label his absence as a passing phase. Meghan observed his response with a more detached composure, remarking that the court had finally articulated openly what she believed had been their objective for years. Yet, her confidence masked an uncomfortable reality. Permanent finality erased expectations, but it simultaneously destroyed all leverage. No discussions regarding a potential return could occur because the option itself had been completely dismantled. She had liberated herself from palace governance, but she had forfeited the power to choose whether she would ever engage with it again. Harry initiated a direct call to Charles, an exchange that lasted a mere few minutes. The king reaffirmed that their personal connection as father and son remained intact, yet he refused to revisit the state decree. Institutional matters, official concerns regarding duties, noble titles, pageantry, and the management of the throne would now be managed exclusively through formal administrative streams rather than personal chats or family go-betweens. Affection was permitted, influence was revoked. Harry disconnected and stood motionless until Meghan inquired about the exchange. He noted that his father sounded depleted rather than hostile, a realization that unnerved him far more than another explosive dispute would have. Animosity could be contested. Exhaustion signified that the palace had moved past resistance into absolute acceptance. Looking directly at him, Meghan questioned whether they were still awaiting royal authorization to chart their destiny. Harry offered no immediate reply, but the query altered the room's atmosphere completely. For years, every choice had been shadowed by the specter of reinstatement. Now they faced a private crossroad that neither the palace nor the public anticipated. For the first instance, the couple had to adapt to a future void of any royal path, a finality that propelled them toward an internal turning point of their own. This critical shift did not unfold before television cameras or via another public statement. It occurred in the quiet hours of the night, long after the phone calls ceased and the administrative text had been reviewed ad nauseum. Harry and Meghan sat together in isolation, without strategists, public relations agents, or court emissaries, framing their next step. For years, the phantom option of a return had underpinned every grievance. Now that exit was sealed, forcing them to decide if this locked door would dictate their identity indefinitely. Reflecting on the years since their departure, Harry recognized how profoundly the crown still dictated their path. Bitterness had tethered him to it, self-defense had kept him reacting to it. The lingering expectation had transformed every family interaction into the opening salvo of a negotiation. Institutional ambiguity, the absence of a clear, codified status regarding their future roles, had now been entirely eliminated by the palace. Yet, blood ties endured. The younger son could still converse with Charles as a parent, but he could no longer leverage those dialogues as a conduit back to state status. Harry finally vocalized a truth he had seldom acknowledged. A part of him had persisted in believing he could return under frameworks that preserved both his autonomy and his royal relevance. He had envisioned a future where he could operate beyond palace jurisdiction while maintaining a significant footprint within the dynasty. Admitting this exposed the vulnerability beneath years of public defiance. The dream had not merely been political. It was emotional validation that his family had not completely moved forward without him. Reaching across the table, Meghan stated that returning would never resurrect the life they left behind. Alliances had transformed, public sentiment had solidified, and the balance of influence had shifted to entirely different players. She emphasized that royal significance, the prestige and institutional validation tied to official membership in the monarchy, could not be sustained without sacrificing the autonomy they had sacrificed so much to secure. She urged him to stop measuring their potential against a paradigm that no longer existed. Harry opened a drafted reply that accused the court of malice, filled with resentment, finger-pointing, and a final demand for validation. He evaluated the prose once, then cleared the text entirely. Instead, he dispatched a confidential note to Charles, stating his comprehension of the state decree. Though he refused to pretend it caused no pain, the message contained no ultimatums, conditions, or threats of public retaliation. Reading the message in isolation, Charles breathed a slow sigh of relief. The king did not confuse it with a full reconciliation, but he detected a profound shift in his son's vocabulary. For the first time in years, Harry had written without requesting concessions, litigating history, or challenging the throne. Absolute silence followed from California. The court had braced for a media counteroffensive, yet none materialized. The public would soon judge whether that stillness indicated strategic maneuvering or quiet resignation. As the couple retreated from immediate conflict, the dispute expanded far beyond family boundaries, dominating headlines, broadcasts, and the very gates of the palace. By daybreak, the internal grief of 4 relatives had been converted into a global referendum. News anchors disrupted programming, publications redesigned their layouts, and crowds congregated near royal monuments, parsing the calculated terminology of the decree. Some interpreted it as vital fortitude, others viewed it as a dynasty succumbing to rancor. Yet across every analysis, one reality stood absolute. The instability clouding Harry and Meghan's status had concluded in the most high-profile manner imaginable. William observed the initial television bulletins alongside Catherine, as commentators framed the announcement as the absolute finality of the Sussex departure, rather than an intermediate phase of mediation. A hybrid role fusing an independent private career with selected official state assignments was emphasized by analysts as being completely off the table. The prince remained quiet until an anchor declared it the permanent termination of the Sussex royal era. Muting the television, he confessed that hearing those sentences broadcast to the world carried a far harsher sting than establishing the boundary within secure rooms. Catherine studied his demeanor, recognizing that while this clarity safeguarded their lineage's future, it simultaneously forced him to witness the permanent estrangement of his brother, framed as historical advancement. Court publicists refused to provide even a single emotional footnote, reiterating only the authorized statement, fully aware that further commentary could reignite the very feud the text was crafted to extinguish. Buckingham Palace, the sovereign's official headquarters, and the public heart of the dynasty now communicated strictly through calculated reserve. Yet that very stillness magnified the weight of every phrase. The less officials articulated, the more irrevocable the verdict became. Harry observed the identical media storm unfolding from California. Archive broadcasts depicted his trajectory from a youthful prince to a soldier, a groom, and ultimately a man stepping away from sovereign obligations. He terminated the broadcast before its conclusion, unable to tolerate his existence being compressed into a sterile before and after narrative, as though the chasm between belonging and exile could be neatly packaged into a brief television segment. Sitting beside him, Meghan recognized the emotional injury immediately. She had anticipated public criticism, but had not foreseen their history weaponized like court evidence. A publication captured the cultural climate with the front-page title, "Palace Closes the Door," beneath which ran a photograph of Harry exiting a cathedral service with the wrought iron palace gates framing his departure. That visual became the definitive emblem of the day. Outside the royal residence in London, a sparse crowd huddled under umbrellas while a reporter delivered the live update. A spectator lowered a small Union Jack, murmuring that it felt as though the family had finally validated what the public had already been debating. Charles refused to watch the media discourse reach its peak. The monarch isolated himself from the commentary, returning to the secluded study where he had endorsed the decree. Media titles could proclaim triumph, collapse, banishment, or endurance. He understood the reality was far quieter and infinitely more agonizing. The public had selected its narratives, biases, and allegiances, but the ultimate weight of the choice would only manifest once the media circus drifted away. When the television reports concluded and the headlines were replaced, the palace stood precisely where it had weathered the centuries, yet the family within its walls had been permanently transformed. Harry and Meghan were now completely liberated from the burden of an expected royal return, yet that autonomy arrived with the sting of absolute exclusion. Charles had shielded the crown, but remained defenseless against personal sorrow. William had fortified the succession, fully aware it cost him the fraternity of his past. The king returned to the endorsed paperwork once the public clamor dissipated. The unyielding institutional reality was now established. Harry and Meghan remained bound to his family through ancestry and matrimony, yet their assignments, authority, and public profiles were entirely decoupled from the active monarchy. Institutional reality dictated the legal framework governing state obligations, leverage, and representation, entirely separate from the personal sentiments binding relatives. The monarch deposited the documents into the vault dedicated to settled state business, his hand lingering on the brass handle before sealing it. Legal finality could terminate public debate, but it possessed no power to dissolve a father's love, remorse, or memories of the son he once assumed would always occupy a place by his side. William internalized the outcome without a hint of celebration, fully comprehending why the perimeter was vital. Subsequent reigns, royal appointments, state pageantry, and public expectations could now advance free from ongoing speculation regarding a Sussex reinstatement. This absolute clarity insulated the throne from continuous renegotiation, preventing private kinship from becoming a backdoor vehicle to state power. Yet this structural stability brought no domestic peace. The future monarch had anchored the institution he would one day inherit, but he had achieved it by accepting that his connection with Harry might never return to its original form. Harry and Meghan committed to absolute stillness. They launched no media counterstrikes, granted no televised tell-alls, and published no statements contesting the palace's decree. Their restraint spoke volumes on its own. The sovereign chapter of their active careers was over, and whatever path they forged next would have to exist entirely without palace validation. The younger prince could no longer calculate success through the prism of reinstatement, just as his wife could no longer evaluate independence against the apparatus she had abandoned. Together, they faced a destiny completely within their own hands, yet permanently uncoupled from the state authority they once wielded. The monarchy emerged with greater internal alignment and less vulnerability to external chaos, yet it also appeared fundamentally altered by the human toll required to enforce its boundaries. The throne endured because it prioritized institutional continuity over emotional concession. Charles carried sorrow, William carried duty, Harry carried estrangement, Meghan carried the ultimate confirmation that the dynasty had marched forward without them. No triumphant figure emerged at the conclusion of this tragedy. Two destinies had simply been rendered completely irreversible, one tied immutably to the crown and the obligations William would assume, the other belonging to Harry and Meghan far beyond its perimeter. The gates closed because every party finally accepted that history could not be rewritten. And, with that consensus, the dispute dissolved. The institution marched onward. Harry and Meghan remained external to its official architecture, and a family discovered that certain doors are locked, not out of malice, but with the devastating certainty that unlocking them would only tear the wound wider. Thank you for tuning in. Kindly remember to like and subscribe, and we shall connect in the upcoming feature.